My name is Danielle Albers-Safer. I'm from the University of Colorado Boulder, and I'm going to start off today by talking about some of the basic principles of color discriminability. That is, how do we know that we can detect differences in our data? To illustrate this challenge, I'm going to use a quick example. So, how many categories of bars would you say you see here? My guess is you see 3 equal greens, so you think there would be 1 category of bars. However, we can easily manipulate the differences between the colors of these bars to, for example, change the lightness or change the hue and be able to detect and distinguish different categories that might emerge. And changing these values and allowing us to detect more categories is an example of discriminability. So when we're talking about discriminability, we're really talking about this question of how well can we distinguish between a set of data values. Core to this idea of discriminability is the concept of a just noticeable difference, or JND. A JND is the smallest color difference that can be reliably detected. Granted, this depends on your definition of reliable, but typically speaking, reliably detected means that it's detected between 50 and 75% of the time. In the context of data visualization, when we're thinking about JNDs, we essentially want the smallest critical color difference between any 2 values to be at least 1 JND in size. So that is, a JND corresponds at the very least to the smallest important difference in our data. One key thing I would like you to notice here is this idea of color difference. Color difference inherently speaks to a mathematical relationship between any 2 colors in our visualization. And that's really what we're going to focus on in our discussion of discriminability during this tutorial. I'm going to focus on this idea of discriminability over 3 different topics. The first of these is color spaces. How do we define the mathematical attributes of a color? From there, we'll move on to thinking about differences. Once we've translated a color from the thing we see to a set of mathematical values, how do we understand the differences in those values? And I'm going to close by talking about some unique challenges for considering discriminability in data visualization. When I use the term color space, I really am talking about a way of mathematically defining color. One of the most familiar that we have is from physics, where we talk about this idea of wavelengths. So any number on our wavelength scale corresponds to a very specific color. However, folks who've used color in practice know that any single number is not necessarily a very rich way of thinking about color in the ways that we use it in visualization. We need to consider other factors like what is the saturation or what is the lightness of that color. We can draw on a variety of traditions to reason about the important aspects of color for creating effective visualizations. In particular, we can think about the ways that computers represent colors, the way that psychologists reason about colors, and the ways that artists design with colors in order to create an effective visualization. And one of the interesting things that manifests from all of these different color spaces is that they actually correspond to different components of the construction and use of visualizations in practice. We build visualizations on computers, we see data encodings based on principles from psychology, and we design visualizations using ideas from art. So in practice, we care about all of these different ways of thinking about color. I'm going to start with the computational representation of color that's used in computer graphics and used by our monitors, and that's this idea of sRGB. So the RGB cube has essentially our 3 primary colors, which correspond to the primaries that we have in our monitors. So this is our blue, our reds, and our greens. In a way, this simulates what is going on in the eye, where we have our short, medium, and long cones that serve as our photoreceptors in the eye. So while this feels like it should be a very intuitive and very perceptually useful space, in practice, RGB is not perceptually uniform. We might see bigger or smaller steps in the data, corresponding to equal size steps in RGB. And you can see an example of this here. So each of these rectangles has an equal distance from each other in RGB, but we have a much harder time distinguishing the greens from one another than we do the blues. So what this tells us is that equal distances in RGB are not equal to equal perceptual differences. One of the questions that we might start to ask based on this observation is, how exactly do we see color? And this gets to the basis for many psychological models and color spaces. In psychology, we have this idea of opponent processing theory. The basic idea here is that we have receptor cells in the brain that take the input from our rods and cones and process it in systematic ways. And these ways correspond to different color opponency pairs. So we have how much black or white is present, how much red or green is present, and how much yellow or blue is present. One logical conclusion is that if our eyes and brain, so our visual system, process color using these opponency pairs, maybe that's a useful way to represent color in a way that aligns with the perceived differences that we see between color values. And this is one of the fundamental ideas underlying CIELAB. So lab has three axes: lightness, or L, how much red or green is present, or A, and how much blue or yellow is present, or B. And the A and the B plane essentially form a hue and saturation plane at each level of lightness. One of the nice things about CIELAB is that Euclidean distance in CIELAB is intended to be perceptually meaningful. CIELAB is what we call an approximately perceptually uniform space. That is, our perceived difference in colors approximates our perceived differences in data. So a larger difference in color would correspond to a larger Euclidean distance in lab, would correspond to a larger data difference. I think it's pretty intuitive how this is useful for visualization. However, in practice, CIELAB does provide an imperfect representation of the ways that we see color. And CIELAB was actually originally designed in 1976, so color science has had a lot of time to improve on the CIELAB model. The most recent standard in color science is the CIE Camo 2 model. And what this is essentially designed to do is provide us with a more precise representation of how people perceive colors. So for example, in the sunburst diagrams here, a perfect perceptual model would align all of the dark and light blue squares and would have essentially a perfect starburst pattern where we would have equal sized spokes that are perfectly straight lines. And while you see a little variation in both models, so here CIELAB is on the left and CIE CAM is on the right, you can see that the alignment and the spokes in our CAM model form more of this ideal sunburst pattern than what we see in lab. And what that tells us overall is that it's a more perceptually precise model. In part, CAM succeeds because it has a more sophisticated consideration of things like the colors around a particular target and other kinds of contextual factors. As a result, CIE CAM ends up being very complicated in practice. There are implementations that you can use for visualization. For example, Connor Gramazio has developed a package in D3 for using Camo 2. But a broader problem with both Camo 2 and Lab are that they are both somewhat counterintuitive to work with. We don't necessarily think of designing colors as a function of how much red or how much green there is. And this takes us to this idea of how do artists think about color. So when we're thinking about the ways that we reason with color in design, we think about things like luminance, how light or dark is a color, saturation, how dull or bright is it, hue, is it red, is it green, is it orange? These are more intuitive ways of reasoning about color that map really well to a lot of what you will see in color encoding design in practice. And art offers us a number of spaces for computing these kinds of relationships as a function of these more intuitive parameters. A more accessible way of reasoning about color according to lightness, hue, and saturation is the idea of HSL or HSV. So these two spaces provide us with a redistribution essentially of RGB that allows us to think about, instead of reds, greens, and blues, how much lightness, how much saturation, and how much hue is present in a given color. So this can be a really nice way of modeling and designing colors, but it suffers from a lot of the same limitations of RGB, and that it is not perceptually uniform. One compromise that we can make if we're reasoning about color spaces is we can actually express CIELAB using polar coordinates. And this is a color space called CIELCH, or you will occasionally also see it as HCl. So when we're thinking about LCH, we still have our lightness axis, but we also have colorfulness and hue. So colorfulness is a proxy for saturation, and it's expressed as the distance between our chosen color and the lightness axis. And then hue is the angle around this polar circle. So to summarize our discussion of color spaces, we often will use artistic spaces such as HSL or HSV to design a color encoding because these are intuitive ways for humans to reason about color. We can then interpolate these colors using perceptual spaces. These spaces will allow us to match the perceived difference to our data differences. As I mentioned, a key idea behind discriminability is that the differences between two colors are meaningful. And in order to start talking about the differences, we have to move beyond just the representation of color in a particular space to look at how do we then compare colors in those spaces. Perceptual distances allow us to compute difference values that correspond to the actual differences we see between colors. In visualization, what this means is that we can map larger data values to larger perceived color differences. In other words, the difference between our black circle and white circle should be computed as significantly larger than the difference between our black circle and our gray circle. Among the most popular difference equations that we see in visualization is CIE delta E. So delta E corresponds to the Euclidean distance between two colors in CIELAB. The basic idea with delta E is that one delta E should approximately equal one J&D, or one just noticeable difference. Euclidean distance is simple. It's fast and it's intuitive to compute, and it's intuitive to translate into meaning. I know that a larger Euclidean distance means there's more distance between 2 points, and that the relationship between those distances should be linear. Well, delta E is used very commonly in visualizations. In practice, it's subject to a number of limitations. One of those key limitations is that the real world is actually too noisy for one delta E to be large enough. And this is a problem with all of the color difference equations we're going to talk about. They're all modeled on this idea that we have a perfect observer exploring data on a perfectly calibrated monitor in a perfectly isolated environment with no ambient light, no ambient noise, all sorts of factors that aren't a function of reality, where we have different brightness levels and different calibrations on our monitor. People are sitting at different distances. We're often looking at really small marks on the screen, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And we have all sorts of residual lighting and other factors that might influence our perceptions of different colors. One of the more nuanced issues with delta E, however, is that it tends to fail with saturate colors and with very large color differences. I'll talk about large color differences in just a bit, but when I'm talking about differences in saturate colors, if you look at the two circles on the left, those circles represent a dark red and a dark blue that are both highly saturate. That pair of colors generates a delta E of 10. So does the pair of yellows on the right, where we have the bright yellow and the more goldenrod color. Those two sets of circles do not appear to be equally distant from one another. And this is a broader problem within CIELAB, where, again, these large saturate colors can lead to misleading delta E scores. So delta E was developed in 1976, and color science has had a lot of room to improve since then. Delta E94 was developed in 1994, and it essentially adjusted for saturation using empirically derived weights. In other words, we take our Euclidean distance function and we weight our L, A, and B scores differently as a function of the actual perceived distances in those colors. So delta E94 gives us a more precise version of perceived color difference. However, it's subject to limitations in that it often mismanages perceived lightness. For example, while the green dot here is closer in perceived lightness to the white dot, in delta E94 it is equally distant to the black dot. So this suggests that we have an issue with the way that delta E94 is handling lightness differences. And in 2000, CIE introduced the delta E2000 model, which offers improved lightness weighting from delta E94. But as you can see in the equations used to derive this distance metric, things have gotten fairly complicated. And when it comes to building interpolations and starting to think about encoding design, using these delta E2000 functions starts to become a lot more difficult and a lot less intuitive to work with, and potentially computationally prohibitive depending on the kinds of operations we're working on. So in practice, CIE delta E tends to be good enough for most visualization applications, and it tends to be much simpler to reason over. And much of the precision that's actually added by the sophisticated differences that we see in the delta E94 and the delta E2000 models actually tend to be mitigated by external confounds. For example, we don't have perfect monitors, which can actually distort the colors that we see and reduce some of the differences between our colors. And some studies that we've done in the past actually show that these differences may be enough to get rid of several of the benefits of using delta E94 in practice. Also, color encodings and visualization tend to rely on lightness steps. We have this notion or this guideline around lightness monotonicity being a good way of helping people discriminate between data values. And we also tend to encourage minimizing hue steps in many cases. For example, if I'm designing a sequential ramp, I tend to privilege changes in lightness over changes in hue. And so these simpler models like delta E can actually do a reasonably good job of approximating those kinds of limited and very controlled differences. There's one key caveat here, and that comes with very large color differences. So if I were to ask you which is a greater difference between the colors, the green and the blue, or the purple and the red, there's not necessarily a good and meaningful way of reasoning about that in delta E. It's not intuitive that delta E should be larger for green and blue or larger for purple and red. At these larger distances, things like we would use for categorical data, color difference takes on a different meaning, and we instead start to think about the more cognitive associations and cognitive distances between two colors. One of the best models that we have for working with this in visualization is the color naming model that was developed by Hero and Stone in 2012. So the basic idea behind this model is that colors that have different names are easier to discriminate and easier to cluster with one another. If you think about your Gestalt principles, if I have light greens and dark greens, those colors are going to appear more similar to one another than if I have light greens and light blues. So this color naming model is intended to model how people assign names to colors based on their CIELAB values. And what we can do is we can look at those mappings and use those to compute vectors of names associated with different colors based on their representation in lab space. And we can use these vectors to compute categorical color differences. This tends to be really useful in things like palette design, as Karen is going to talk about in a little bit, because what this will allow us to do is compute the similarity between any two color values. So both of these sets of differences allow us to reason over how different any two values are going to be perceived when we're mapping data to color. However, visualization offers a series of unique challenges for understanding color discriminability. These challenges range anywhere from thinking about how do I intuitively represent my data to how do these models actually change as a function of the marks that I use, even down to how accurately do I have to follow these models to generate effective and discriminable encodings. Well, when we're thinking about developing sequential encodings, we care about being able to discern fine-grained differences between any sequential pair of colors. That is, the actual distance itself matters. In these cases, we're going to use just noticeable differences and equations like our delta E model to tell us how good our encoding is. When we're thinking about categorical encodings, we don't necessarily care about the pairwise differences between any two colors. We just care that they are sufficiently different. And this is where things like the color naming model can come in handy. Diverging encodings are an interesting hybrid of these two considerations in that we essentially need to use both our continuous delta E metrics and our categorical color name metrics. To break this down a little bit, when we have a diverging encoding, we're essentially dividing our data into two groups. So in this case, we have group A, which is our blues, and group B, which is the reds. So we care about being able to categorically distinguish between group A and group B, which is where our color name model will come in handy. But we care about being able to distinguish the different gradations within each group. And this is where our delta E models will come in handy. There have been recent studies that have shown that color naming actually might be useful for thinking about more than simply being able to distinguish categories. If you're curious about when and why this might be the case, I'd encourage you to check out a paper that Carrie Rita and I have that will be presented later this week. A second challenge when it comes to applying conventional color difference ideas to data visualization is changing geometries. For example, the bars that you see here represent 7 different levels of color difference in CIELAB, taking into account delta E. As you can probably see, we don't necessarily see those distinct 7 levels, and this is why designers will often manually go in and correct for these differences. However, even after you've hand-tuned for particular differences, making marks smaller or even changing their shape can actually dramatically change the number of perceived differences in our color encodings. And visualization offers a large library of functions for reasoning over discriminability as a function of our visualization geometry. So some basic rules of thumb are that we know that discriminability changes inversely with mark size. As marks get smaller, it's harder to tell the difference between them. And that change levels off as marks continue to get larger. We also know that marks can be more distinguishable when we make them longer. So if I move from scatterplot points to bars, that lengthening process can make it easier to discriminate between my colors. Finally, more recently, we found that discriminability varies as a function of a mark's shape. So for example, it's easier to tell the difference between the 2 green scatterplot points here when they're represented with filled squares versus unfilled squares. And it turns out that the relationship between a mark's shape and its discriminability can be very rich and nuanced. One last element of discriminability that's unique in visualization is this idea that discriminability needs to be the exclusive driver of our encoding design. So one common fallacy with encoding design is that effective color encodings must be perceptually linear. In essence, this is often taken to mean that good encodings form a straight line in a perceptual color space. For example, if we take our hand-designed color brewer greens here, if we were to interpolate between the endpoints, we would get something that looks like this. And what you can see here is that interpolating endpoints along a straight line in CIELAB gives us bland and somewhat indiscriminable colors. It turns out that in practice, expert design ramps are seldom linear, and they often have significant variations in terms of the distances between any adjacent pair of colors. So for example, here we have this color brewer greens mapped on the left to our AB plane in CIELAB space, and on the right to our LC plane in CIE-LCH. And you can see that the shapes are not straight lines, and the distances between points actually often vary. In work we presented at VIS last year, we actually analyzed 222 handcrafted ramps, and we saw the same pattern over and over. That is, designer color ramps actually take very interesting and unpredictable paths through perceptual color spaces. What this indicates is that discriminability, while key for understanding how we actually process data differences, is not all that we need to understand in order to use color effectively in visualization. We have other factors like aesthetics, semantics, attention, contrast, all these other ideas that Karen and Francesca are going to talk with you about later in this session. With that, I'd like to wrap up our discussion of discriminability and take a moment to thank the people who have shaped this work and invite any questions that you might have.